All right. Thank you, Madam Clerk. So I'd like to call this work session to order on APD Overview, update on current departments, organizational structure, procedures, roles, and responsibilities, recruitment, and training process. Let's go ahead and start with the roll call.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Here. Good morning, everyone.
Ms. Allard.
Good morning.
Mr. Constant. Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Ms. Kennedy.
This is Cameron. It looks like Crystal's having difficulty getting on.
I'm on just on the phone, but I'm trying to get on with Teams, but I'm here. Thanks.
Ms. LaFrance.
Here.
Mr. Perez-Verdia, we know you're here.
Here, yeah.
Mr. Peterson. Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Zalatel.
Here.
You have a quorum, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. So as usual, if you want to get in the chat or in the queue, excuse me, feel free to put it in the chat, or if you can't get to the chat, text to me. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Perez-Verdia or Ms. Kennedy to set the stage for this work session.
Mr. Chair, this is Crystal Kennedy.
Go ahead.
So thank you. You know, this idea came out of a conversation that we'd had earlier with Chief Dahl, just in regard to understanding, being able to better understand the functions of the Anchorage Police Department. There's a lot of diverse divisions within the department, and there are also things that are listed on the budget that talk about some of the positions within the police department. But that gives such a kind of a small picture of what all the police department really does and is responsible for. So we thought it would be a good idea for the assembly, and especially with Cameron and I just being, you know, kind of newer members anyway, we wanted to get just that bigger picture, that broader perspective of all the functions and the structure within the Anchorage Police Department. So I'm sure we have Chief Dahl on here, and I apologize, I got on kind of late, had some technical difficulties. But I just want to turn it over to Chief Dahl and kind of let him give us that big picture of all of the functions and some of the structure within the Anchorage Police Department. So thank you, Mr. Chair. So Chief Dahl, I think you're on.
Go ahead, Chief.
All right, thank you all very much. I appreciate it. I'm using Teams, obviously. I'm gonna engage in some screen sharing here in a little bit. But as always, and those of you that know me know, I love to talk about the police department. So thanks for spending a little time with us today. Good morning and happy Friday to everyone. It's rainy, so that's unfortunate, but it's okay. I've got somebody here that is a little noise, but I muted them, so I think we're good. All right, let me see if I can get screen sharing to work, and we'll dive right in. I am going to, okay, I hate to admit this, but I'm actually going to use SAP, so can everybody see my SAP screen okay?
We can. Mr. Trainee isn't here, so you're fine. Also want to note for the record that we've been joined by Mr. Constant and Mr. Weddleton.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, so finally something good from SAP. So I'm gonna roll through the organizational structure because I know it can be really confusing sometimes exactly how the department is sort of set up and organized and what those things do. And I'm just gonna use the org chart tool in SAP to kind of help illustrate that, so you guys have something to look at and kind of follow along with while I talk. And then I'm gonna talk a little bit about some of the other things that Ms. Kennedy mentioned and Mr. Rivera mentioned, some of our recruiting and training, kind of how things happen here, how we bring new people into the organization and stuff like that. So away we go. You'll see that that first bullet was just the whole department, and then the first level of breakdown in the department is between is the deputy chiefs. So we have Deputy Chief Curl and Deputy Chief McCoy. DC Curl is in charge of administration, and DC McCoy is in charge of operations. I'm gonna break down administration first. So the first level of breakdown there is, you can see we have a captain in charge of the administration division, but then we have some non-sworn, non-rep managers in charge of various sections of the department. APD resource management, APD fiscal management, and then grant management. So resource management is a function that basically the resource manager, obviously all of our facilities, managing our supply chain, stuff like that. Obviously a lot of interaction with the grants that we have as a result, because a lot of grants fund equipment. Our financial manager, Orrin Carpenter, is in charge of helping us sort of keep on track with our budget and our financial management throughout the year. And then we just recently brought a full-time grant manager on board at APD. It's something we worked for quite a while with OMB to get structured. And that's Tina Verhazen, and she is a longtime city employee that came to us from finance, has a lot of in-depth experience in managing our grants. That it's something that she was doing along with other places in the city. So now she's helping us with full-time grant management and reporting inside of APD, but also seeking out new grant opportunities and new partnerships. So we recently, for example, met with Cook Inlet Tribal Council on ways that we could strengthen our partnership there in recruiting, but also in joint grant opportunities. So we connected Tina with some of their grant masters at CITC, and they're now working together to look at places that we can do things together to benefit both organizations. So we're pretty excited to have her on board. So if you look at the admin division and step down into that, you can see that a lot of our non-sworn positions reside in the admin division here at APD. So APD Data Systems, we have our own IT section here at APD with quite a few employees there. Obviously, the police department nowadays, like pretty much any organization on the planet, very IT dependent. So having them on staff is very helpful for us as a 24/7 operation, especially with like the dispatch 911 center and all of our officers in the field. Having them available is critical. You can see the 911 center, it's labeled as Emergency Communication Center, is here. We have Amy Foraker is the non-sworn manager in charge of that. We have about 62 employees inside the 911 center right now, and that is all of our call takers, all of our dispatchers, all of the first line supervisors that they're typically referred to as clerk 3s because of their job classification inside of APD. But those are our first line supervisors in the dispatch center. They all reside here. We have the property and evidence section. Again, we have a non-sworn manager there. Amber Garrison, she oversees all of our property and evidence operations. And, you know, property and evidence sort of sounds simple at first, but then when you think about it, it is every single thing that the police department touches that's a physical item and that we take custody of. And those are things like evidence of a crime, right? If officers are out in the field and pick up evidence, sometimes it's things that we take for safekeeping. If you, for example, somebody that's involved in a serious vehicle collision and for some reason they have property with them that we feel needs to be, we need to take custody of to kind of hang on to for them until they're able to come and get it from us. We would call that safekeeping. We would take that property in. And there are lots of other circumstances where we end up taking property for very long periods of time in the case of serious evidence in serious crimes like homicide or sex assault, or for very short periods of time like that safekeeping we talked about. And at any given time, we have, I think, around 130 or 140,000 pieces of property in our custody that we're trying to manage. So it's a fairly substantial operation. And of course, right now, our Elmore facility is undergoing a rework that is largely going to be expanding the storage space that we have for property and evidence, because that's a significant issue, and most of you are very familiar with that. So the next section there is police training, and if you step down into that real quick, you'll see that that's background and recruiting, but also the police academy. And so both of those sections have a police sergeant in charge of them, but they report to a lieutenant that oversees both sections. Both of those are housed at our Jewel Lake facility, the training center. Backgrounds and recruiting, pretty obviously, those are the folks that work on recruiting new people into APD. You know, a lot of attention gets paid to the hiring and the recruiting of sworn personnel, but they also do all the non-sworn also, which is, as everybody knows, a very critical component of the police department. They do all the outreach and the recruiting, trying to get people to come and apply for jobs at APD. And then once those applications are made, and I think I should point out, the applications initially go through HR, MOA, Human Resources, and then and they do some initial screening, and then they send job candidates to us. And once they come to us, the backgrounds and recruiting unit takes them and works them through whatever the appropriate process is, depending on the job classification. So sworn officer might, well, it does look substantially different from, say, somebody who's coming to work in our records section. There's just a different level of stuff that needs to happen as part of that process. And let me just, I guess, let me touch on that real quick, because I know when I spoke to Mr. Perez-Verdia and Ms. Kennedy, they expressed an interest in some of that. So just real quickly, sworn officers, as the applicants make their way through that process, it starts off with that initial screening at HR. They do a written test. They do a physical ability assessment that's job oriented. They do a written test. I think I mentioned that already, sorry. They do a psychological evaluation with a contract psychologist, and then they do a polygraph, and then they go through a background investigation with one of the backgrounds folks. Some of those steps are things that we found to be useful and we've been doing for a long time, and some of them are required by state regulation and statute for the certification of law enforcement officers. Somebody who's coming in to work in records, they're still going to have that background check. We have certain criteria for anybody that's going to work at the police department. And again, some of those things are set by state and federal regulation, because people working here have access to confidential criminal justice information system records. And then, but they don't go through like a physical ability assessment or a psychological evaluation, things like that. And that's how people get into the initial training pipeline. Now, once they're hired, if you're a sworn person, you go to the police academy. That lasts about 6 months. And then, and again, a lot of the topics that we teach at the police academy are things that are required by state regulation in order to be certified as a law enforcement officer. But a lot of them are things that we found to be useful, you know, and for example, there's been a lot of discussion of implicit bias training, cultural awareness, things like that. There's some level of that required by state regulation, but we do a lot more than the minimum necessary, and we try to involve local community groups as much as possible in those kinds of things. So, for example, I think some of you probably know Mr. Kevin McGee, who is a representative of the NAACP here in Anchorage. He comes and teaches at the academy as part of that. And there are several other people that do as well. And we're constantly looking to build on that. Recently, we've been talking to Native Movement and I always forget the other one. Native Peoples.
Action.
Go ahead, jump in and save me.
Native People's Action.
Native People's Action, thank you. I do not know why I cannot keep those two straight. But we've been talking with Charlie quite a bit, and really they're very interested in helping us with that academy training, and so we're working to integrate them into that. We've had some really good conversations. I know Ms. Quinn Davidson was present for one of those, and those discussions are ongoing. We talk with them fairly regularly. And then from the Police Academy, sworn officers move into field training, which is really kind of on-the-job training out in the real world, doing real policing, with a senior police officer acting as a trainer, but also kind of a mentor and a guide. That process takes about 4 to 5 months. And then they start off as brand new police officers, all on their own. Records clerks go straight to records. They do on-the-job training there in records. And then and they have a little brief kind of initial training session before they start that. And dispatchers go to a dispatch academy that lasts for a few months, and then they start sort of a field training program, similar in a way to sworn officers, but it is obviously in the dispatch center taking live calls. And I'm sure most of you recall the training for dispatchers takes almost a year as well. So that's kind of a quick overview of the training pipeline there and people coming in. Back up into the administration division.
Before you continue, Chief, I have a question from Ms. Alto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Chief. I had a training question. Can you talk a little bit about what, and maybe it will go further in this line, but ongoing training is? We talked about the academy, but how, things may, what's the progressive training or the ongoing training? Because I know we have officers who stick with us for a long time.
That's a great point. Yeah, I totally spaced out the in-service training. So that's part of that police training section under Lieutenant Henry. And thanks for reminding me. So we have 3 officers that are assigned full-time to do in-service training for the police department. And they do it for the whole department. Even though they're sworn officers, they coordinate it for everybody. That's something APD has not been great about over the course of my career. It's something that myself, DC McCoy and DC Curl were very interested in starting up. We've all been here for about the same amount of time and seen throughout the years that it was not consistent inside the department. We're very committed to providing ongoing in-service training to all of our employees. And we thought it was worth committing 3 full-time positions to. And we did that about a year ago, I think, maybe a little longer. And we have seen some benefits. We're continuing to build on that. So those 3 officers coordinate, because as you can imagine, coordinating training across a staff of over 600 employees who work a 24/7, 365 schedule is complicated. And we don't ever want to leave anybody out. So some of the things I mentioned as far as the training programs that we've worked into the police academy when it comes to cultural awareness, implicit bias, and things along that line. Those are also things that we're working into that in-service training program as well. So I really appreciate Ms. Alatel bringing that up, and I can't believe I forgot it. So hopefully that answers your question, but that's something that is ongoing and we're constantly trying to build on as well. Anything else on that before I move on?
That's great. Thank you, Chief.
Yep, thank you, ma'am. So the training, we have an administrative manager who sort of oversees things like payroll, the impound section. And so let me just touch on impounds real quick. So we have 2 people that do payroll for us that are APD employees, obviously in conjunction with kind of the overall MOA payroll. Payroll for us is very complex for a variety of reasons. The impound section, we have 2 employees that work in the impound section. And at any given time, APD has around 425 or 450 vehicles in our possession. And that seems like a shocking number, and it actually is kind of a shocking number. The reason why is, like any other item of evidence, sometimes we're stuck with that particular vehicle for quite some time. Imagine a vehicle that's involved in a serious assault, like a shooting or a homicide or something like that. Because it's evidence and we're required to preserve the best evidence in a criminal case, it can be difficult for us to turn those loose. And so we end up sitting on them for a long time. We're constantly working with the district attorney's office to try to release those vehicles back to whoever they belong to. We don't want to sit on them. That's another area that we have sort of critical storage issues as an ongoing thing. So we're constantly trying to kick those loose, but those two folks that's their full-time job, is trying to manage the in and out there of all those vehicles. And then finally, our record section here, again, a non-sworn manager, about 46 employees working in records. And I think that the number of people classified as records clerks is actually greater than that, but sometimes they work assigned to other units. And as we get into some of the operational divisions, you'll see them pop up there again. And so that doesn't capture all of the employees that are records clerks. So that's a good chunk of the admin half of the department. I'm going to back up and drop down into the operational division. So obviously, DC McCoy is in charge of operations. He has 3 divisions: detective division, patrol division, crime suppression division. But he also has internal affairs reporting directly to him, and public affairs, which of course is MJ and his team. So I'm just going to kind of work my way through these divisions as well. Some of them, obviously, patrol and detectives seem pretty obvious. Crime suppression, maybe a little bit more nebulous. So let's start there. So crime suppression is composed of a lot of the units that are sort of citywide specialty units that have sort of a specialized focus. So, for example, the community policing team, or the CAP team. Lieutenant Burrington is there. The CAP team is broken down into several different units. We think of them traditionally as the uniformed officers that belong to the community policing team that we see out doing things, working on neighborhood projects. Most frequently, they get called to assist other parts of the city with homelessness issues. But it also includes our crime analysis center and the mobile intervention team. Those 2 units also work for Lieutenant Burrington. Crime analysis has, I think, there's 1 vacancy right now, but should have 5 employees total, a non-sworn manager, and then a number of analysts. And they're doing kind of 2 things. When we start talking about, and we will talk a little bit later about some crime stats, they help us keep track of those from a strategic perspective of, hey, kind of what's going on across the city, as we talk about the way that we're going to deploy resources and stuff like that. But what they also do, and what we're really working hard to develop right now, is more of a tactical analysis. And that is, hey, we had a crime happen at this location yesterday that we're working on. And, how can we analyze the existing data that the police department has to support the detectives or the investigators that are working on that particular crime? And so that's something that we've really been working hard to build up here. It's not something APD has really ever had the capacity to do, but it's something that I think is very important and that we're continuing to work on. And then I think everybody's pretty familiar with the mobile intervention team, and this is just where they reside. So next section here is school resource officers and traffic, Lieutenant Roberts. I think everybody's pretty familiar with the SRO program, but this also includes the traffic unit, which most people are familiar with. But inside the traffic unit are also the community service officers, and those are the non-sworn staff that AP has that work out in the field. You probably see them. They wear light blue shirts typically, and they drive pickup trucks. And they're the ones that work on a lot of the neighborhood kind of nuisance issues, parking problems, abandoned junk vehicles, stuff like that. There's only 3 of them for the entire city, so they're a very small unit, but they do a lot of really good work. This also includes our fatality investigators. So when there's a really big wreck that involves serious physical injury or death, those are the folks that have a lot of really specialized training to be able to go look at all the bits and the marks on the roadway, figure out what happened, and then reconstruct that crash and determine exactly how it occurred and what happened. And then, of course, the traffic officers that we all think of out, doing nothing but traffic law enforcement. The IDE unit is the Impaired Driving Enforcement Unit. That is a unit that consists of 1 supervisor, 1 non-sworn clerk, and 6 sworn officers, or 7 maybe. That's a totally grant-funded unit. It's a grant from the Alaska Highway Safety Office. It's a pass-through grant from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They've been 100% grant funded for the last few years. It was supposed to be a grant program that they were 100% funded, and then the funding level rolled back over a period of years. But they've been so successful that NHTSA has continued to fund them in their entirety. We're hoping that continues, but we're in discussion for next fiscal year right now as to what that looks like. But they've been very, very successful. They work from 8 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. So kind of those peak DUI times. Not to say that DUIs can't occur at any time of the day, but those tend to be the most prolific time. And so they're out there doing traffic enforcement, but also primarily looking for DUIs. The Special Investigations Unit is something that you'll actually hear us. Well, there's a couple units in there, so let's pop into them real quick. These are not labeled very well in SAP. Unfortunately, it says task force officers. Really what that is, those are officers that we have assigned to various other agencies, our partner agencies. So for example, the FBI has a task force on human trafficking, and they have some agents and some of their non-sworn folks assigned to it. We actually have a detective assigned to that full-time who does nothing but work with our federal partners on human trafficking. And that's something that we actually, it's kind of one of those areas that's in the background. It doesn't, it kind of doesn't spring into public awareness very often. So we get asked occasionally, oh, does APD work on human trafficking at all? Well, yeah, we actually have a detective that's assigned to that task force. It's a multi-agency task force, full-time. It's the other unit that's listed here, it says Vice, but really what that is that's our, that's the group of officers that we have that's assigned to the statewide high-intensity drug trafficking area initiative. And again, that's a multi-agency initiative. So APD has, I think, 5 or 6 detectives and a sergeant working on that. But we have people from the DEA, from FBI, from Alaska State Troopers, ATF, all working with us on that. And then we also have somebody that works out at the airport with the state's task force on that. And they're looking at drug trafficking. That's drugs coming into Alaska and money going back out. And that's their full-time focus. That's been something that we've really just stood up in about the last year. Really, it was only about a year ago that it really became a full-time operation. And so far, they've been very successful. We're really looking to interdict the flow of illegal narcotics coming into Alaska. And of course, you know, we all know Anchorage is a hub for the entire state for a lot of things, and we tend to be a hub for illegal narcotics as well. So we want to make sure that we're doing the best we can to interdict the flow of those things as they come into Anchorage. And then special teams management. This is kind of a variety of things that fall in here, but the primary two are the K9 unit and then the investigative support unit. And everybody's familiar with K9. ISU sounds a little weird. It's kind of hard to understand what that is. We have a group of officers working in the investigative support unit along with the supervisor, and their primary role is to support detective investigations. So a detective is working a case. They need to locate people that are witnesses or suspects, or ultimately they've worked the case to conclusion and they have arrest warrants for suspects. The investigative support unit goes out and apprehends or locates those people as quickly as they can. And that's something that we also just stood up in the last couple of years. It was a gap that we recognized inside of APD that we were seeing very high rates of violent crime. And part of the problem was detectives were working the cases and figuring out who the suspects were. And then we really didn't have anybody that was dedicated to locating those people and taking them into custody. And it was just, well, eventually patrol will have contact with that person and then serve that arrest warrant and take that person into custody. And we really wanted to have a more focused approach to that. It didn't make sense for that to just kind of be randomly happening. And so we really wanted to kind of be very proactive at that. And so we started that up a few years ago. That's what that unit does full time. They have plenty of business full time, and it's all across the board. It's homicide, robbery, assault, sex assault, human trafficking, whatever the case happens to be. They're there to support detectives, and they've been doing a great job of it. And that's kind of a quick overview of crime suppression. I'm going to drop into detectives and patrol real quick, and then roll into some other things. These are a little bit more straightforward. Everybody's pretty familiar with patrol, broken down into 3 shifts: day shift, mid shift, and swing shift. So day shift runs from 7 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. Swing shift runs from 3 in the afternoon till 1 in the morning. Mid shift 11 at night until 9 in the morning. There's some other specialty units kind of salted into patrol, things like the warrants unit and the domestic violence investigators, stuff like that. And those are assigned to day shift patrol. I don't know if it'll show that in here. I think it just breaks down into all the employees. Okay, it does show that. So the warrants unit is part of that. That's where it says warrants unit, which they are the warrants unit. But again, that's kind of mislabeled. It's really the unit that assists in moving prisoners back and forth from jail to court, municipal prisoners, but also they're proactively going out and serving domestic violence restraining orders. They're managing the intake of those. The domestic violence investigators live here, and the domestic violence follow-up officers that go out and actively check on people that are subject to domestic violence restraining orders and making sure that they're observing the restraining placed on them, and then contacting petitioners to make sure that they aren't having issues. And then let me talk about detectives real quick, and then I'll hit on a few other things here. So inside the detective division, 3 teams and the crime lab. So team 1 is really sort of violent crime. It's robbery, assault, homicide. Team 2 is largely property crime, fraud, burglary, theft, things like that. And then team 3 is mostly sex crime. So it's special victims unit, which is adult victims of sex assault. It's crimes against children, which are obviously sex crimes against children, but other abuse cases. And then it's the cyber crimes unit, which deals with a lot of child pornography, online child crimes, things like that. And then the crime lab, APD has its own crime lab, and that is currently housed at our Elmore facility. But I think probably all of you have seen that we're in the process of moving them to live in the state scientific crime detection laboratory just down the road from Elmore. The state has a substantial amount of unused, very nicely put together laboratory space, like real dedicated laboratory space that we are going to move into and take advantage of. We think that's going to be a really, really good deal for APD, and that frees up space at the Elmore facility to do more things, primarily evidence storage, but it also, rebuilding the crime lab was going to be very, very expensive, and it lets us avoid that cost. And then, this says public affairs, but it's really community relations, and I think everybody's pretty well familiar with that. So that is an overview of most of the department structure. So one other thing is facilities. That was mentioned at sort of our pre-meeting for this. The primary department facilities are, of course, headquarters downtown, the Elmore location, which is houses the 911 center and dispatch. It also houses that impound unit that I talked about, the property and evidence section. All of our, the bulk of our records section is there, and some other smaller specialty units. We have the Jewel Lake Training Center facility, which is down there, Jewel Lake and Diamond. That's where our academy takes place. Also, backgrounds and recruiting is housed there. And then finally, we have the outdoor training facility out at Birchwood that just came online a couple of years ago. You know, I wanted to kind of pivot to, we talked a little bit about training in the academy and sort of intake. I wanted to talk just a little bit about kind of where we are as far as sort of progress with the police department. You know, there's obviously been a lot of focus on the police department over the last few years, growing the police department, adding resources. You know, in 2015, there really started to be sort of a focus to growing the number of sworn police officers here at APD. We all know that takes a really long time to do. We've spent years doing that. We've had a lot of success. We went from about 360 up to a total authorized of 443. And we have about 430 on board right now, I think, today, give or take a few. Let me see if I can change my screen sharing here, if I know how to do that. It's questionable. Let me try something else. Okay, hopefully you guys can see a bar chart. So there's been a lot of focus to that. And then, of course, in 2017, 2018, the community really started feeling a lot of additional crime activity, frankly, and there was a lot of discussion of that, and there are a lot of different theories on why that occurred, and there were obviously lots of things happening in the community at the time. But it was also the time that we really had kind of come to really start to be able to deploy some of those additional resources that we had at APD. And so, you know, as I worked my way through that org chart, and I talked about things like the investigative support unit and other things that we've started doing just in the last couple of years, those really came online kind of in the 2017, 2018 timeframe. We finally reached a place where we weren't just struggling to meet, you know, the daily call for service level. We were able to do some things kind of proactively. And I think it started to make a difference. This chart represents a time period of January 1st through June 30th for each of the years 17, 18, 19, and 20. So that same first 6 months of those 4 years. So if you look at this chart, you can see the first 6 months of 2017, you know, we experienced over 2,000 theft calls for service, and that steadily decreased the last few years, where, you know, we're down almost half this year compared to 2017 with about a little over 1,100. And that has kind of been the same story across most of our major property crime categories. I think that we're really fortunate that we've gotten to a point where we have been able to deploy those additional resources. We've been very conscientious and thoughtful about the way we've done that, and I think we're starting to see some results in the community. And I will point out, these are call for service numbers, not the uniform crime reporting numbers. And the difference between those two things is calls for service are what people actually called the police department and reported. And uniform crime reporting is at the end of all of it, after police officers wrote reports, and the folks that live in our record section that are called classifiers go through and they categorize it according to the federal guidelines for what constitutes a particular crime reporting category type of incident, and then we report that to the state and the federal government. So it's kind of cleaned up and modified a little bit, but those two numbers can look differently. So I wanted to make it clear. I think the calls for service are more interesting because I think that's a better reflection of what the community is feeling. If you look at our violent crime numbers, those are in decline as well, not quite as significantly as the property crimes. And of course, the sample sizes, especially for sex assault and robbery, are much smaller. But you can see that those are sort of gradually stepping down as well. Sex assault this year is substantially less than last year. It's not zero, so there's still work to be done there. But it is that's an area that we were able to reinforce too by adding additional detectives. So with the reduction in the number of reports and the additional detectives there, I think we have better victim outcomes because each detective is handling fewer cases at any given time. But you can see again, sort of a general decline here. And then the final category, I just pulled out homicides individually because the sample size is typically much smaller than the other crime categories, and so it doesn't display well on the other charts. But as you can see, so far at least, 2020 seems to be trending a little bit better than some of our previous years that we experienced very high numbers of homicides. So I think we are starting to see some success in sort of across the community in some of the broader categories there. Let me see if I can stop this screen sharing again. Okay, now you guys are back to looking at me. So I think that's generally decent news, right? I mean, that's kind of what we hope to see. We applied some additional resources. It looks like there's an impact in the community. So we feel good about that. We started off with sworn, and then we started having a lot of discussion about non-sworn personnel and some of the shortcomings that the department was experiencing there. Initially that was in the dispatch center. Not only were we experiencing longer 911 wait times, and we were all hearing about that, right? We were hearing about it at the department, but many of you were hearing about it from constituents. So we have been adding staff to the 911 center. But on top of that, as we all knew, they were burning a tremendous amount of overtime in dispatch, just trying to kind of make ends meet. So far this year, we still have some open positions that were created new this year. We're in the process of recruiting and filling those. We're getting pretty close to hiring. I think early next month is the plan to bring some folks on board there. In the meantime, we have filled some existing vacancies and some of the new positions from the last couple of years. And some people that were sort of on long-term medical leave have either come back or left APD, and we've been able to fill those vacancies. On top of that, we made some structural changes to the way that dispatch was staffed and scheduled. And as a result, we've seen so far this year about a 50% reduction in overtime. And we've also seen 911 wait times decline. So those wait times are getting shorter. We're just a little over 10 seconds. I think it was like 11.8 or something, average 911 wait time. The last time I looked for sort of so far this year. And the ideal kind of industry standard is 10 seconds or less. So we're getting pretty close to that. I think we're going to be there as we work our way through the rest of this year. The other place that we were hurting sort of with our non-sworn staff was in records. We've all heard and talked about the backlog of records requests. If you didn't know, that backlog peaked in March of this year with a little over 5,000 records requests backlogged at APD waiting to be fulfilled. Earlier this week, Captain Case, Deputy Chief Curl, and Jennifer Leneve, who's our records manager, came to me and let me know that we are all caught up. We had this week we had 95 requests in the queue, and that is something that we can fulfill in sort of our model time frame of 10 business days or less. So we hope to maintain that throughout the rest of the year. They worked really hard to catch up. And now we want to see if we can maintain that on an ongoing basis. But I think that's really good news. The backlog that we had, as I've said many times previously, was in no way acceptable, and it just that is not a reasonable service level for the public. So really happy to see that we're caught up there. We have some other requests for things like photographs and audio and video and stuff like that that are still a little bit backlogged because those take a lot longer, but now we're pivoting to those. We want to clear those out as well. So pretty good news there. And there's one final thing that I wanted to hit on that. And it flew right out of my little brain. So one last thing I want to mention is if you haven't been on a ride along with APD, I would strongly encourage you to do so. I know some of you have, but I think some of you still haven't. We would love to have you. We are not doing ride-alongs right now for the general public because of COVID-19. But for assembly members, if you're willing to come to APD and observe our mitigation protocols, which include a health screening and of course mask wearing and things like that, I think we can make that happen. And we would definitely like to get you out and kind of see what our folks do on a day-to-day basis. And that doesn't, I mean, it should be with patrol, but you can also spend some time in the dispatch center and see how that works. And we would encourage you to do that. And I think that's pretty much it. I'm sure that there are some questions. I think that there are even some chat messages out there. So I'd be happy to answer those. And then obviously I have one other thing stuck in my head that I can't remember. So when that pops back into my little brain, I will bring it up. But Mr. Chair, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Chief. All right, so we're going to go ahead and do questions for the remainder of the time we have. I'll start with Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief, so I believe you're aware that a number of us have been working and talking with Deputy Chief McCoy and the Mental Health Trust and some other folks about trying to set up there are different words for it, some different models, but some kind of mental health response core that would involve dispatch and specialty teams that wouldn't be sworn officers to go out and respond to certain kinds of calls. And so I guess I'd like to hear from your perspective, if we were to set that up, what kind of calls would you see being removed from the stack, as they say, and what parts of your organization could that perhaps relieve some pressure from?
Okay, great, thanks. So yeah, we've talked a lot about that, and there's different, there's different names for that, right? Crisis Now or Cahoots, or I think there are a couple of others floating around, but they all kind of revolve around the same concept, which is that having people other than law enforcement officers out in the world addressing behavioral health and substance abuse and those kinds of things. And we definitely support that kind of program. It would definitely take some pressure off of the patrol division, because those are primarily the people that end up dealing with those issues. And it would allow us to do a lot of things that we are getting asked for on a regular basis that we really have a hard time getting to. So it's things like the neighborhood nuisance issues, right? With a problem house that maybe is a drug trafficking house, or louder racing vehicles in a neighborhood, creating unsafe conditions for children. It's patrolling parks and trails, right? We get lots of interest from the public in that, and that's something that is difficult for us to get to with the current resources that we have, because a lot of effort goes into combating those things that we could offload into a more appropriate organization like that. Another example that is not something that we often talk about, but I mentioned one of those detective teams is property crimes. And right now, about 4% of the property crime cases that come into APD get assigned to an investigator. So I think that's an area that we could continue to make progress on. I feel like we could do better than that. And having some of the pressure on some of those non-law enforcement calls that we get sent to, having that alleviated, I think would give us an opportunity to do a lot of other things that we're being asked to do that we're not able to get to. So, we're definitely interested in seeing that happen. You mentioned dispatch. I think that's probably something that in most places they have their own dispatch center to run that kind of operation. But we would love to be partners in helping get that set up, because we have a lot of expertise to offer in running a 24/7 dispatch center. And I'm not sure that should be housed in the 911 center that APD runs, but we could certainly help get that set up. So we're very interested in seeing those discussions continue to move forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chief. That was awesome. That was a lot of information, but it was really good to get that big picture of all the things that the Anchorage Police Department is involved in. But I have two questions.
Yes, ma'am.
One of them is in regard to records, and you mentioned that you've all caught up, and that is good news because I know that was like a monumental challenge. But if somebody's requesting data or statistics, how does that work? Where are you at with that? How accessible is information like that?
That's a great question. So it's actually not very accessible, and it's not accessible to us either. So if I want to know in a certain part of town what's happening in a crime category, that's difficult for our crime analysts to pull out. It's not something that I have kind of an easy button to press and get. I would very much like to have an easy button like that. We've talked in the past about APD needs a new records management system and computer aided dispatching system. And as we move forward with that, that's really something I want to see built into that, because if it's easy for us, then it'll be something that we can make easy for the public to access as well. And that's really not the case right now. So for example, if an Anchorage resident or a media outlet comes to us and says, hey, I would like to know something about APD's data. So can you answer this for me? Basically, it's a research project, and we have to dedicate a lot of staff time to that. There's a cost and expense associated. And so, we have to inform whoever the requester is what that is and go through that process. And it takes a long time, and it usually costs a lot of money. And I would love to have that information be much more readily accessible. So that's still a challenge.
Great. Okay, thank you. So maybe that's something we can talk about there. Obviously it's got to be some kind of canned software out there that's available that maybe we can consider, but a conversation for another day. But my second question is in regard to budgeting. I know when we first started this conversation, oops, sorry, I got a phone going off. When I first started talking about having this conversation, there was a concern about how the budget process works. One of the things that I noticed in the budget document is that you have a list of positions that basically when we look at it, we see, oh, there's patrol officers and senior patrol officers, and kind of just the way we get the line items in the budget and that. But you mentioned that it's really kind of problematic in terms of how you actually staff. And trying to kind of fit into those pockets. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what the challenges are with kind of the budget process versus how you actually want to be able to allocate staff?
Sure. So I think if you look at our budget, and I just met with the Budget Advisory Committee a couple of days ago, and we talked about this a little bit. When you look at the budget, I think it can be difficult to view the budget and then understand exactly how the department is structured. And I think, one of the reasons is that, typically we do, zero-based budgeting at the municipality, right? So we roll last year's budget into next year. We account for some changes, if we know that a certain thing is going to have, some kind of contractually obligated increase, whether it's labor or like a software program that has an increase year over year, that gets built in. And then we look and we're like, okay, but we want to add some positions or we want to add some new functionality that gets tacked onto it. And then we move forward. And of course, over time, the police department has changed, right? Like we would expect any organization to do. We've adapted to meet new challenges in the community, and our structure has changed, and the way that we're organized has changed. And I just walked you through that organization, which if you look at that, but then you look at the budget document, they don't necessarily marry up. And, I think that we could maybe make those two things align a little bit more. We have the flexibility we need to take the budget that's approved and fit it into our organization. But I think that probably there could be some better alignment there. I want to be really careful though, because I recognize that any sort of suggestion like that is a massive amount of work for OMB. And they have lots of other work to do. So I don't want to be dumping work on a different department. And I will say that the folks at OMB are amazing, and they are constantly helping us manage our budget, make those translations into sort of real world operations. And I really, I can't say enough good things about them and the help that we get from them. So, but I've spent a lot of time, the org chart that I just walked you through in SAP, when we first started SAP, it looked nothing like that. And so we've spent a lot of time really in the system organizing and building out the department so that the structure in the management system looks like the real world structure. I think there's some additional things that we could do to kind of make the budget marry up in the same way, because it is confusing to look at. When you talk about patrol officer or senior patrol officer, records clerk or senior records clerk, those kinds of things, those are job classifications that are typically a result of the collective bargaining agreement, and they have different costs associated with them. And so that's why you see them broken down that way in the budget document. But it's not necessarily a reflection of exactly what they do. So for example, you might see, a broad category of operations with so many senior patrol officers in it, but a lot of them are actually detectives in the special victims unit, right? So it can be difficult to look at the budget document and understand exactly what that means kind of for boots on the ground, I guess. Does that answer your question, ma'am?
Yes, I thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chief. That does. I mean, I just wanted to make sure that the process allows you the flexibility that you need for staffing and doesn't in some way hamstring you and, and just cause more complications. But obviously you want the most efficient and effective way of staffing as possible. So I just want to make sure that our budgeting process doesn't hinder that. But anyway.
No, I don't. So especially because OMB helps us out, I think we generally have the flexibility that we need.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. With that, I think we are out of time. I want to thank Ms. Kennedy, Mr. Perez-Verdia, and the Chief for helping to organize this work session. It was very informative. Looking forward to future conversations. Thanks, everyone. See you all in 10 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Happy Friday.
And happy Friday.